Hi, I'm Mark Baumster. I'm Deputy Managing Editor here at Education Week, and I'm happy to welcome everybody to our live session after the Essa Summit. Thank you very much for joining us online for a really enlightening chat. I have three of Education Week's reporters here to talk with us about different topics having to do with the Every Student Succeeds Act and about the session that they just continued moderating. We start with Evie Blad, who was doing a session here on alternative yardsticks for accountability and assessments under Essa. Daryl Burnett, who moderated a chat on school report cards and the data that needs to be reported under Essa. And Allison Klein, who talked with us about Essa school improvement and accountability issues. And I wanted to start off with a little bit of a general question. After sort of interacting with hundreds and hundreds of different folks who posed questions to you, what is your sense of what some of the major friction points are as Essa now goes from being kind of a theoretical thing to something which is actually being implemented on the ground? Where are the areas of kind of tension and conflict?
So I think there's still a lot of confusion even about what Essa is in my room. Some people didn't understand that it's the law that replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. So, and Essa passed in 2015. So it was really interesting to me that there's still a lot of questions and just really different levels of information about what this law is and what it means. And for anybody watching our live stream who does have that question, like what are the basics of Essa, we do have a video explainer and kind of a written out explainer on our website. So you should definitely check that out.
Allison, just to follow up just a little bit, how does that play its way out in the accountability arena among the kinds of questions that you receive from our online guests?
So in terms of questions from the guests, they really wanted to know basically when schools were going to be identified. Some of them had some really specific questions like how are states and districts following through with what are called Essa's resource equity requirements, which basically says that, if a school is identified as low performing, part of the deal is that the district needs to take a hard look at the resources that school is getting, especially if it's been identified because it's having problems with students in special education or English language learners. So there was that level of detail, but then questions about what is this law? So it was a real range.
Now, Daryl, you were interacting with folks who were specifically looking at the actual reporting requirements under Essa, which are significant at the state and the district level. What kind of questions are you getting from folks?
Yeah, a lot of people are, now that they've seen some of the state's first drafts and trying to attempt to report exactly how schools match up. A lot of people had a lot of questions about delivery methods of report cards, what the web design should look like, what states are doing things well, what states are not doing things so well. My guest, Katie Carroll from CCSSO, pointed out that it's not too late to engage with states and trying to give them feedback as to how to design the report cards. So a lot of questions around just the design and the actual technicality of actually collecting and disseminating data, making sure the data is accurate. So there were a lot of questions around what the first draft report cards are.
Were they really digging into the specifics of what the data is, or was it really more logistical questions about how you ought to be formatting that information for the public?
I think there's still a lot of concern about the transparency and accessibility of report cards. That's just a big concern amongst stakeholders, amongst principals, superintendents, parents, et cetera. So.
Now, Evie, you were hearing mostly from folks who were talking about alternative assessments, different ways that students could be assessed under the Every Student Succeeds Act. And
not alternative assessments, but alternative indicators of school success.
Can you explain
for accountability?
Just a little bit of the difference between these?
Yeah, so Essa required states to adopt at least one sort of alternative measure to broaden their accountability systems to say whether a school was succeeding or not. And in the early days of the law, there were folks who were wondering whether some schools might or some states might adopt measures of students' social and emotional growth, or some of these new kind of measures that researchers are tinkering with to see if we can change the way that we educate kids and our approach in a really radical way in schools. But most states agreed with researchers who issued cautions that those measures just aren't sophisticated enough, that they're prone to biases, and they're not ready to be used for accountability purposes. So what we saw when states came up with their plans is that most of them agreed to use chronic absenteeism as a measure of school success. And that's generally defined as missing 10% or more school days for any reason, excused or unexcused. States all defined it a little bit differently, but the big kind of underlying principle here is that to tackle that, schools are going to have to tackle a really broad range of issues that keep kids away from school. You know, some are connecting kids with social workers to help them get transportation to school. Some are addressing issues related to engagement. And some are changing their disciplinary practices to reduce the suspensions that can contribute to that number.
To what do we have a sense of why states would be looking for this particular indicator? I mean, you indicate that there may be some soft spots and some logistical hurdles in using that indicator. Why are they defaulting to this particular one rather than other things?
Well, for one, there was already a really successful grassroots network of advocates in states who dealt with absenteeism issues, who were community folks who worked with state schools and districts who were plugged in with their state boards of educations as they were designing their ESSA plans. For another, while there are some concerns about whether this data can be gamed and how to measure it with integrity, a lot of folks feel like it can be measured a lot more reliably than some of the other things that were being proposed as additional indicators under ESSA. And, you know, the big push from attendance advocates is that to raise attendance levels, to lower chronic absenteeism levels, it requires input from everyone in a school. It's not something that teachers can do alone. It's not something that nurses can do alone. And so they feel like it's a really holistic indicator. Does this school have a strategy to address the needs of every child? You could see how that could be kind of overwhelming for a school as well. A lot of these things are influenced by a child's life at home, and that's a tough thing to tackle.
Daryl, how will these kinds of indicators eventually show up in the state's report cards?
Yes, states are going about this in all kinds of ways. You know, they all kind of chose different. Some states actually did it in-house and designed the report cards. Some states outsourced this to different companies to design the report cards. You know, I think a big debate that states had was actually what information to present first. I've heard from experts that say, you know, report cards are states' ability to display to the public what their biggest concern is or what their strategy is, what they take most seriously. And so whether you put the absenteeism data in front of the achievement data, in front of you know, disciplinary data, states have a way to bury or highlight data. So you know, states are going about this in all kinds of ways, but I've seen one of the things that a lot of folks are pushing for states to do is to make the data comparable, so you can look at other schools, how they perform in some of these indicators, but then also to dive into the data to match it with other points. So what is the poverty rate at this school? Where is the school located? Is it in a rural or urban area? To sort of categorize it. And I think, you know, states' ability to do that kind of varies.
Now, how well are states doing? Do we have any initial data from any national organizations or people who are watching these things about how well states are actually picking up the task?
Yeah, well, DQC, the Data Quality Campaign, has already come out and said that states are really struggling in both the reliability of the data. They say a lot of the data is inaccurate, that they're not fulfilling a lot of the ESSA's requirements. States have kind of rebutted that and said that, you know, these are our first drafts, that the first rollout of report cards are going to be, there are going to be some areas that we are still trying to collect data on. So, you know, this is an area of concern from some advocacy groups and some parent groups, but I think, you know, states say that they're working on this.
I wanted to stay with state data for just a moment to ask a little bit about the money the money piece of this, because for the first time, the public is theoretically going to be getting some interesting information about school spending. Can you talk a bit about that?
Right. So there's this little provision in Essa that requires states to break out school-by-school spending, which is the first time that folks have actually saw this level of detailed spending. Most of the time, people understand school spending in district averages. So we see, per pupil district average, a district might spend $6,000. But when you go deeper into that data and show exactly how districts distribute that money between schools, you see variances between anywhere between $18,000 and $3,000. I mean, this kind of varies depending on which district you're in. So states are still trying to figure out exactly how to collect and disseminate this data. There's a lot of concern amongst school administrators that this will confuse the public, that the data won't actually show exactly things such as poverty rates at school, such as how many spec ed kids you have at a school, et cetera. So this is a area to be determined. Yeah.
Allison, I wanted to ask you in just a couple minutes that we have left. The kinds of things that Daryl and Evie were both talking about, what happens if the states actually do not comply with this? What's really the situation at the federal level? Do states, are there situations where the states may just kind of drag their feet, and what's the hammer if that happens?
Sure. So if a state doesn't comply with any part of ESSA, the Department of Education can put part or all of their Title I funding on what's called high risk status, meaning that it's like, hey, if you don't fix this problem, we might take some of your money. And this has actually already happened in Arizona, where they have some testing issues. They need to kind of pick one test, and that hasn't really happened in Arizona. And so Betsy DeVos has threatened to take $400 million, I believe, of Arizona's Title I money. And the state chief there, who's new and wasn't on the job, I guess, when this problem first arose, is working to try to address that issue. So there is a lever the department has, but they're really reluctant to use it. Especially this department is very interested in local control. They really want to give states as much running room and prerogative as possible. So I wouldn't look to the department to throw the hammer down all that often. I guess what a state would be doing would have to be really clearly in violation of the law.
So on the accountability side, really things are still, it's still a work in progress when it comes to the compliance on state report cards, on whether they're actually finding the indicators, the kind of alternative indicators that the law requires, and we're still kind of seeing the pieces be put into place.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're finding the indicators, because every state in their ESSA plan had to identify at least one indicator of school quality or student success, which is part of what Evie was talking about. And a very few, thought about things like discipline or school climate, but overwhelmingly states chose things like chronic absenteeism and college and career readiness. So states are working to measure that, and that's something that will be reported on their report cards and factored into either school grades or at least into identifying which schools need more support.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank all three of you here, and I would like to encourage anyone who would like to see more of this to thank you very much for staying with us on the follow-up. Please go to edweek.org to take a look at an archived version of our webinar and read over the chat questions, and keep posted for our coverage in the future. Thank you. Hi, I'm Mark Baumster. I'm Deputy Managing Editor at Education Week, and I want to thank everyone for participating in today's Essa Summit. We're here for a short discussion with three of the reporters who were staffing individual booths at the summit to talk about different subjects and to answer some of our questions from the hundreds of viewers that tuned in. Andrew Ujifusa here was talking on the panel having to do with ESSA funding flexibility. Sarah Sparks was taking a look at our discussion on student assessments. And Christina Samuels was taking a look at what ESSA means for some of the most vulnerable students that are covered by the federal education law. I want to start with a general question here. After listening to really the hundreds of questions that came in, what do you think that some of the major friction points are with regarding to that the public has with regarding to ESSA and its implementation? Some of the main areas of concern that you're sensing from our listeners and readers.
I can start. So I think there are just mainly a lot of questions about, how certain funds can be used. One of the big discussion areas in my little room was about Title IV. For example, these are grants that districts are supposed to use to make students, more well-rounded and create safer, violence-free schools. And, there are a lot of questions about, can these funds be used for special education, for example? Can they be used for math instructional coaches? Very specific questions. So I think people are really getting down into the nitty-gritty of the law and, exploring just how much flexibility there is, for example, or how much flexibility districts actually have under the law.
Now, this is a very sensitive area right now, particularly with discussion of school shootings and whether some of this money can be used to arm or train teachers with firearms for school safety purposes.
Yes, that's been perhaps the reason Title IV has gotten a lot of attention in the news recently. Betsy DeVos, after a lot of controversy and public discussion about it, has said that, she's going to leave that up to states ultimately to decide whether, again, this Title IV money can be used to purchase firearms and arm teachers. We had a district superintendent as a guest in our room today who said, we've never really contemplated that, and moreover, and this is very important, obviously, the State Board of Ed has said that it will not look kindly upon and will not approve districts' efforts if they're interested in using Title IV money for that to arm teachers. But you might get very different answers in different districts in different states. So I think it highlights, again, just the issue of districts are still probing, how they might use this money. Based on survey information from last year, there are clear areas of interest, like social emotional learning and supporting more school counselors. But, there are a lot of different things this money can be used for, and some of them are controversial and some of them are less so.
Now, Sarah, I want to shift gears just a little bit to talk about assessments. ESSA does have a provision in it for a pilot program that will allow states to find different kinds of student assessments and use those and then scale them up. What did you hear from the folks in your session about the popularity of that program and whether it's gaining any traction?
Well, there was a lot of interest, but I think there's been relatively little take-up by states in using some of these pilot programs. At this point, only Louisiana and New Hampshire have started doing those pilots, and a few other states are exploring using ACT and SAT. And one of the things I heard a lot in the room, similar to Andrew, there were a lot of basic questions around how does this flexibility work? How does it allow us to change some of the more criticized assessment pieces from NCLB era? For example, changing the frequency with which and the grade levels with which students are tested. And there's less flexibility there, and people are still kind of talking about how to work with that. Also, a number of states during the NCLB era changed their state laws to have a number of different requirements for assessments, and those seem to be having some bearing and challenge for states that are interested in exploring new and very different types of assessments.
So the states themselves might be still tied up not internally and not have as much flexibility as they might like under the new law.
Particularly,
Go ahead.
yeah, particularly because there's no additional money with this particular set of flexibility arrangements.
Christina, now the folks who were coming to your chat room were really taking a look at some of the most vulnerable students, those students that Essa was supposed to be providing additional information on. Can you explain a little bit more about what you were hearing from folks?
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a lot of questions, and I think, Sarah, it might have been the same for you, of how this worked, and people wondering whether ESSA facilitated certain programs, whether it would support dual language learners, how does it support, different types of educational initiatives. And one of the things that was interesting to me from covering special education is I think people were thinking that ESSA is more prescriptive than it is in terms of what it really says. ESSA is supposed to be helping, helping states close the achievement gap between different subgroups, and there's different ways to facilitate that work. But it doesn't go in and say, this is what you must do, or here is a program you put in place. Those are the things that the state does, and I still think that there's a number of questions about what is the state doing to facilitate some of that work. There also, my guest was Allison Sokol from Education Trust, and one of the things that she and others have brought up is that they are concerned that the law that the states have not taken an aggressive enough approach in really looking at subgroup accountability. They're concerned that there are ways to hide the academic performance of students with disabilities, that you could still be performing, or other students in other subgroups, that those groups of students could still be performing poorly, but that performance could be masked by a school's overall rating. And so their encouragement is really for people who are interested in this area to look under the hood, because you cannot just look at a grade or a number score or a dashboard or however the state is trying to do this, and then walk away saying, okay, all students in this school are doing well. There's still work that needs to be done to be much more transparent in that area.
That was something we heard in the assessment conversation. There were several people who voiced concerns about how these more innovative assessments would take into account students with disabilities, particularly students with more severe disabilities who would normally fall under the alternative assessment under ESSA. And Lillian Pace from KnowledgeWorks, who was my guest, works with a lot of states, and she said that they're still working out a lot of basic things on how these more innovative assessments work, and part of that is how to include these students who need different accommodations or perhaps a different assessment entirely.
Is some of this a matter of resources? I wanted to get back to sort of the money piece of this. I mean, is there anything in Title IV or any of the other portions of ESSA that might help out in these areas to provide additional resources and for state departments of education that might be kind of shorthanded in this area?
Well, I can tell you that, when we were talking about, again, Title IV a lot in our discussion room, and I think this might cover different funding pots of ESSA as well, but the average district is not getting a lot of money under Title IV. And one of the clearest ways that's expressed is that only districts, getting more than $30,000 in a year from that funding pot, are required to, do a needs assessment, for example, of what the money could be used for, and caps on certain types of spending under Title IV. So, I would also say that under the Trump administration, despite what some people might hear in the headlines, education department funding and funding under things like Title I for disadvantaged students has been sort of slowly and steadily creeping up. But Title IV and the requirements around it and the relatively small amount of money that districts are getting under it might sort of be an indicator of, they're not necessarily getting a lot of money for exactly the kind of support that they might need in their district. And another area of flexibility that hasn't gotten as much attention under ESSA is this weighted student funding pilot, where districts can, if they choose, try and tie together certain funding streams and attach them to individual students so that the money follows the child, so to speak. But it hasn't proven to be something that many districts are interested in. Only 5, I think, have gone for it so far. And part of the reason is because it's a federal program designed to push a certain priority, but there's no funding attached to it. So I think that sort of exemplifies some of the things that districts are going through. Either there's no funding attached to it, or it may not, give them everything they need for their work.
So some concerns and some maybe lack of momentum in a couple of these different areas. And in just the minute or two that we have left, pose a kind of general question. We're 3 years into after the passage of Essa. What is your sense of, based on this and other things, the sense of just how much awareness there is of what Essa can do, just what's the horsepower behind it, and really kind of the level of consciousness among districts and folks at the grassroots level about where we're going with the law?
I mean, I think it depends on the issue. Like Christina was saying, I think around some issues like subgroup accountability and sort of looking under the hood and trying to see how groups of students are doing and not just focusing on a single score. I think that those areas have gotten a lot of attention due to advocacy and sort of public relations efforts by civil rights groups. But other areas, like where can this funding go, and so maybe some of the more nuts and bolts type questions, I think there are still some questions, and some people may still be in sort of the No Child Left Behind era of thinking, which is not their fault. It's understandable, given how long No Child Left Behind was around. So I think the answers can really vary on that.
There was an interesting thing in the assessment conversation. A number of states and districts are starting to use their Title II money to train their teachers in assessment literacy, to get them either their existing assessment system or these more innovative systems, to get them up to speed on that.
Bring the teaching force up.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I just took away from this is that Essa, when Congress passed Essa, the idea was to return more power to the states. And I think that people are still sort of thinking that there's a huge federal footprint here. There is. I mean, obviously the feds have money and power, but that a lot of questions really, that advocates really need to be pressing their states if they see issues that are of concern, it's when it comes to subgroups.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew and Sarah and Christina, for this discussion. And I thank everybody for tuning in for our end of the summit wrap-up. Please go to edweek.org to take a look at the archived chat itself and peruse the questions that we received and follow up and give us some feedback, please. Thank you.